Born in London, England on the 8th of February 1985, Joseph McCann's crime spree started from a very young age. When he was a small boy, his family moved onto a council estate in Manchester, and it was around this time that his interest in criminal activity started. Aged just 11, he had his first run-in with the law, and by the age of 13, he had already been convicted for theft. He and his two brothers created such fear amongst the community. The following multiple complaints to the council, the family were eventually evicted in 1998. As he got older, more arrests followed, including carrying a knife, criminal damage, and the handling of stolen goods. He would set fire to cars and threaten children and the elderly. Despite moving, the brothers frequently returned to their old council estates and continued what was described by the newspapers and neighbors as a campaign of terror. It wasn't long before the brothers were all issued with antisocial behavior orders, commonly known in the UK as ASBOs. They were among the first people in the UK to ever receive this. The order banned them from entering the Beswick area and exhibiting physically or verbally abusive or antisocial behaviors in the city of Manchester. This didn't appear to have much of an impact on the boys, as they were photographed laughing and swearing at the crowd while coming out of court. In the Beswick area, crime fell by a third, and one supermarket claimed that their revenue had risen by £14,000 after the ASBO against the boys was given. Their lawyer claimed it was against their human rights, and they appealed the ASBOs 3 times. This eventually resulted in them taking it to the Court of Appeal in 2001. But these appeals were flatly denied by the court. In 1999, the McCann family moved again, this time out of the Manchester area. They moved to the south of England, where the brothers continued their criminal activities. Around 2007, Joseph was living in Bedford. He'd recently become a father, but was not present for the birth nor in the baby's life due to spending time in prison. He was released later that year, but on the 27th of December he was arrested and jailed again for burglarizing an 85-year-old man's house and threatening to stab him. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Fortunately, the elderly man had CCTV outside, and he was swiftly caught and sent back to prison in September of 2008. He was sentenced to imprisonment for public protection, or an IPP, and ordered to serve a minimum of 2 years and 6 months inside. His IPP was a form of an indeterminate sentence, meaning that when his sentence was done, the parole board for England and Wales would have to determine whether or not he posed a risk and whether or not it was safe to allow him back out. He would be on a 10-year-long license, meaning that if any criminal activity happened in those 10 years, he would be recalled to prison immediately. While in prison, various professionals and offending managers expressed their deep concern that he still presented a huge risk to society. One statement said that he posed serious harm to the public and known adults, as well as a medium risk to children, prison staff, and prisoners. They believed that he could also be a massive threat to teenage girls and showed signs of wanting to sexually exploit them. Due to the analysis of the professionals, his many appeals for release were denied, and he spent over 8 years in prison. While Joseph was doing time, his brother Sean was also serving a 2-year sentence at HMP Peterborough for assault. Sean took his own life while in prison. Joseph completed several rehabilitation courses and was eventually released on license in March of 2017. After he was released, he went back to Buckinghamshire to live with family, and then quickly moved out and off the radar. This meant his offender manager was not able to contact him or keep track of where he was. Despite his long stint in prison, he wasn't deterred, and the crimes just didn't stop. A few months later, he was arrested again and spent another 2 years in prison. When sentencing him, the judge told him that it would run concurrently with his IPP sentence. However, his offender manager team did not recall him on that sentence. If they had done, he would have had to appear before a parole board again before being considered for release. Unfortunately, this meant he was able to be released just halfway through his sentence. Staff at the prison contacted the probation services about their concerns surrounding the fact his sentence was not running alongside his IPP. They felt he was still, evidently, a very imminent threat to the public. Despite this, in 2019, he was released without appearing in front of a parole board. He continued to move around the country, evading his offender manager team's attempts to contact him. On the 21st of April 2019, his crime spree would take a much more frightening and sinister turn. At 3:30 a.m., he abducted a 21-year-old woman at knife point as she was walking back from a nightclub. He drove her back to an unknown house and raped her. Although he had told her his name was Joel McCann, he was identified the very next morning by Hertfordshire police. However, they couldn't locate him. Just 4 days later, he abducted another woman in northeast London and subjected her to a horrific sexual assault over the space of 14 hours. He was spotted casually making a stop to a drive-through with the frightened woman in the back seat. She was also still in his car when he held another woman at knife point and forced her into the vehicle. While drinking bottles of vodka, he drove to Watford with the women and attempted to book into a hotel. After he was unsuccessful, one of the women smashed the vodka bottle over his head, allowing them both to escape. Investigators drew up a list of suspects based on previous offending, but as McCann had never committed a sex offense before, he wasn't on the list. These cases weren't linked with the April 21st attack until over a week later. Following this, a nationwide manhunt was on to find Joseph McCann, and a reward of £20,000 was put up for anyone who could help. On the May 5th, McCann was back in Manchester. He met a woman in a bar and convinced her to let him go back to her house. Once at her house, he tied her up and raped both her 17-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old son. The daughter managed to escape out the window and ran for help, but Joseph was gone by the time the police and neighbors arrived at 8 a.m. Around 1 p.m. that day, a suspect had been arrested and taken into custody, but it wasn't Joseph McCann. While officers were interviewing the wrong man, McCann had moved on and driven to Bury. At 1:30 p.m., he abducted a 71-year-old woman outside of a Morrison supermarket. He attacked her and raped her. He stole her car, and while the woman was still in it with him, he attacked and kidnapped a 13-year-old girl. She too was sexually assaulted. The pair managed to escape at a service station later that afternoon, but Joseph carried on in the victim's car. That same evening at around 6:30 p.m., he was driving in Cheshire when he forced two 14-year-old girls into the car and threatened to kill them. He was seen driving to a petrol station and buying a packet of condoms. The two girls, although not shown, were in the back. He was on a dangerous and disturbing rampage. Fueled further by cocaine and vodka, he had no intent of stopping, and there was no limit to how far he would take his appalling crimes. Joseph McCann was now the most wanted man in the country. It was in this moment, however, that the police finally caught up with him. They spotted him in his car with the two girls in the back and began chasing him. McCann crashed the car into a Mercedes and started fleeing on foot. Fortunately, the two girls weren't injured, just extremely shaken. He somehow managed to escape on foot before stealing a bike and riding away. He then abandoned the bike and booked a taxi at around 8:15 p.m. It was at this point that roadblocks had been set up in the area and the police were closing in on Joseph McCann. Cheshire Constabulary, however, did not issue a warning to say he was in the area until 8:45 p.m. A police officer stopped the taxi and unknowingly spoke to McCann, who was holding a pint glass, and said he was returning home after a visit to the pub. The officer had a description of McCann and knew he would have a large tattoo on his stomach if it was him. He asked McCann to lift up his shirt, to which McCann shouted obscenities at him and ran out of the taxi. After almost 9 hours of chasing Joseph McCann in cars, on foot and using helicopters, on the 6th of May at 2:36 a.m., he was found hiding up a tree down a rural country lane. After a long battle with negotiators, he was finally detained and arrested. He taunted the police by saying, "The rest of this wouldn't have happened." He also claimed that the young girls in his car had just wanted a lift and he was simply helping them out. He entered a not guilty plea to all the charges related to the 11 women and children. On December 6th of that same year, he appeared via video link from Belmarsh Prison at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London. Mr. Justice Atis was presiding. McCann refused to come to court and complained that he was sleep-deprived and physically couldn't make it in. Not only did he show no respect for the justice system, he showed no remorse to any of his victims. He was tried and unanimously convicted of a shocking 37 offenses. The jury praised the victims for their bravery and courage in coming forward. Joseph McCann was given 33 life sentences in order to spend a minimum of 40 years in prison for his heinous and appalling crimes. The judge branded him a classic psychopath, and his violent and horrific rampage was described as unprecedented. Police believe that for those 15 days they were hunting for him, he was using a variety of disguises, cars, and false names. He was also being hidden and protected by various associates, and 6 people were arrested in connection with concealing him. The frightening and depraved acts that Joseph McCann had inflicted on so many people and communities enraged the public. People couldn't fathom how he had been released from prison with his IPP sentence being ignored. BBC News said that the National Probation Service had not followed the correct procedures, and following his 2017 arrest, he should have been made to answer to the parole board before being released. This would likely have been denied by the board, meaning he would have remained in prison. The Ministry of Justice conducted an investigation and review into what had gone wrong within the broader criminal justice system in dealing with Joseph McCann. Although not normally done, these findings were released to the public. They concluded that the National Probation Service did not manage McCann effectively or in line with the policies and procedures, which set out the expectations for managing offenders who pose a high risk of harm. This is a very concerning case. This was a dreadful, dreadful set of offenses. And in this case, I think there was clearly an individual error. McCann should have been referred to the pro board after he'd committed further offenses. They also found that the management of him as an individual was not consistent enough, with a high turnover of staff and subsequent files and paperwork that needed to be handed over being rushed. Other newspapers suggested that budget cuts and staff shortages within the NPS had a part to play in things too. After an internal investigation, one member of staff was demoted. Harry Fletcher, the former Assistant General Secretary of the Probation Officers Union, would say, "A recent parliamentary answer shows that one person a week is let out wrongly. There has never been a consequence as devastating as this." Giovanni Maria Versace was born on December 2, 1946 in Italy. He grew up with his brother Santo, sister Donatella, and his parents, Francesca and Antonio. He and his siblings were particularly close, made even more so when they tragically lost their older sister Tina. Johnny adored his mother. She was a talented dressmaker, and he became immersed in her creative world from a young age. He made his first dress aged just 9 years old, a striking blue one-shoulder gown. He didn't know it at the time, but this very dress would be worn by Diana, the Princess of Wales, 40 years later. He worked as an apprentice in his mother's sewing business and threw himself into the world of design, color, and art, heavily influenced by Greek history and mythology, as well as artists like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. His ideas about fashion were unique and filled with bold prints and exciting statements. Age 26, he moved to one of the fashion capitals of the world, Milan, to work in design and immerse himself in fashion. He became the designer for several well-established fashion houses. People loved his work and creative flair, and he was encouraged to work on his own collections for women. He presented these at the Palazzo della Permanente Art Museum and put together his first fashion show just months later. In 1978, he opened up his first boutique at the age of 32, and the sky was the limit for him. After this, he began building the empire that would ultimately become the internationally recognized Versace fashion brand. His brother Santo became president of the company, with his younger sister Donatella acting as vice president. The famous Versace logo depicting Medusa's head came from the floors of some of the ruins that Johnny and his siblings used to play in as children. It was an ambitious, family-run fashion business, with Johnny firmly at the helm and having full creative control of the company. By 1982, Versace was working on more than clothes: jewelry, handbags and purses, and homeware textiles. The brand was now rapidly expanding. It was in this year he met model Antonio D'Amico. The spark was instant, and they started a relationship which would last 15 years. Johnny understood the power of celebrity and loved to use famous faces as walking adverts for his designs. He was friends with people such as Diana, Princess of Wales, Eric Clapton, Madonna, and Michael Hutchence, to name a few. He is credited as having discovered models like Naomi Campbell and Linda Evangelista, consistently working with them on ad campaigns as well as on the runway. He adored theater and spent a lot of his career making costumes for various performers and shows, working with everything from operas and ballets to clothing for music videos. Johnny embraced all aspects of fashion and never limited himself to any one area. He designed clothing for Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney's 1983 hit song Say Say, and worked with Elton John to create the costumes for his 1992 world tour. He was recognized as being someone that brought together the worlds of fashion and music in a whole new way. Johnny was working in San Francisco having designed some costumes for the opera when he bumped into a man named Andrew Cananan, whom Johnny seemed to recognize from somewhere. The exact events of this meeting remain unclear, but witnesses claim there was a definite encounter between the pair. His sister Donatella disputes this and denies they ever met. What was for certain is that Cananan developed a dangerous obsession with the fashion designer, one which would ultimately lead to the death of Gianni Versace. In 1993, Versace was diagnosed with a rare form of ear cancer. While he battled the cancer successfully, it had taken a physical toll and he started to delegate some of the business responsibilities. Despite this, in the mid-90s, he was still at the top of his career. Iconic Versace designs such as Elizabeth Hurley's safety pin dress, Princess Diana's purple gala gown, and Naomi Campbell's Andy Warhol pop art statement piece put the Versace brand at the top of the fashion industry. Johnny purchased a villa for just under $3 million, and a year later, he bought the adjoining hotel to extend the sprawling property. 6 a.m., a hot summer's day on July 15, 1997. Always the early riser, Johnny woke up to begin his day. He made several business calls to Milan, then set off on a morning walk around Miami Beach. Usually surrounded by a large entourage, on this particular day he walked alone. He made a stop to buy some papers and a copy of Vogue and grabbed a takeout coffee. Around 8:45 a.m. he was back home and was looking for his house keys in his pocket, when a dark-haired man in shorts and a baseball cap came rushing up to him. A single shot was fired and Gianni Versace fell on the steps of his home. A second shot was fired at him as he lay on the floor, and the shooter quickly ran away from the scene, being chased by one of Johnny's neighbors. But the shooter was fast and he sped off into the busy morning rush of Miami Beach. The ambulance quickly arrived and he was rushed to the Jackson Memorial Hospital. But tragically, just after 9:20 a.m., Gianni Versace was pronounced dead. The manhunt was now on for the shooter, and it didn't take long for the police to identify him. It was Andrew Cananan, a man the FBI had actually been searching for months already. Cananan was a serial killer who adopted different looks and names to carry out a string of brutal murders across a 3-month period. He had moved to the Miami Beach area a couple of months before with his next victim in mind. Cananan was noted as being a prolific and compulsive liar throughout his life, forever exaggerating events and fabricating stories. His childhood was undoubtedly troubled, and it is thought that he had undiagnosed personality disorders. In 1988, when Cananan was 19, his stockbroker father abandoned the family and moved to the Philippines to avoid being arrested for embezzlement. That same year, his mother, who was deeply religious, discovered Cananan was gay, and this sparked a terrible argument in which he threw his mother against the wall, dislocating her shoulder. Cananan was obsessed with living a lavish lifestyle and began dating wealthy older men to help fund his dreams. He was also dealing opioids and cocaine, as well as abusing painkillers, methamphetamine, and alcohol himself. He never settled in any one place and often upped and left, creating a new identity as he did so. He had huge financial troubles with large amounts of debt across multiple credit cards, and he used his relationships with wealthy men as a way of supporting himself and the upkeep of his fake lifestyle. His first victim was 28-year-old Jeffrey Trail, whom he murdered in Minneapolis in April of 1997. Trail and Cananan briefly dated, and when an argument with Trail ensued, Cananan stole his gun and took it to an apartment belonging to David Madsen. David Madsen was also an ex-lover, and Cananan became jealous and paranoid over Madsen and Trail's friendship. Cananan phoned Jeffrey Trail from Madsen's apartment telling him he had his gun. When Trail arrived, Cananan beat Trail to death with a hammer in front of David Madsen and then fled with Madsen across the state. Just 2 days later, Co-workers found Trail's body rolled up in a rug behind the sofa. A duffel bag nearby gave police their first lead. On May 2nd, witnesses saw Madsen and Karnanen driving and eating lunch together just north of Minneapolis. David Madsen's body was discovered a day later, near a lake in Rush City, Minnesota. He had been shot with the gun Karnanen had stolen from Jeffrey Trail. Although police initially suspected that David Madsen may have been involved with the murder of Jeffrey Trail, it became obvious that he was being held hostage by Karnanen. Just a day later, and after fleeing to Illinois, he found his third victim, 72-year-old real estate tycoon Lee Miglin. It remains unclear how they met, but police don't believe it was a random attack. Karnanen bound Miglin's hands and feet and wrapped his head with duct tape. He proceeded to stab him more than 20 times with a screwdriver, as well as slitting his throat with a hacksaw. He then stole his green Lexus LS sedan and took off. When police realized that Miglin's car had been stolen, they also found David Madsen's red Jeep parked on the same street. The Jeep had a car phone inside, and using evidence from the phone, they began to piece together a timeline of events and locations. Karnanen had also been picked up on CCTV with David Madsen as they left the apartment building where Jeffrey Trail had died, and police knew that this was their only suspect. In New Jersey on May 9th, Karnanen shot dead a cemetery caretaker, William Reese, a kind and loving family man who was dedicated to his job. Reese was killed completely at random. Police speculated that he was shot purely because Karnanen wanted to steal his red Chevrolet pickup truck. When police arrived on scene, they noted that the same gun had been used, and they knew instantly it was Karnanen. On May 12th, he checked into the Normandy Plaza Hotel in Miami Beach, paying a month in advance in cash. Living in Miami until the middle of July, he remained undetected and unnoticed. With the police having no luck in locating him, Andrew Karnanen was added onto the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He had killed 4 people in 12 days, and there seemed no end to his rampage. Karnanen was so confident he wouldn't get caught. He pawned a gold chain he had stolen from one of his victims in a nearby shop. He filled out the form with his real name and current address, even showing his ID and leaving a thumbprint on the document. As required by law, a copy of this document was given to the police, but for whatever reason nobody picked up on this, and his name, quite literally, went to the bottom of the pile. On July 14th, Karnanen left the hotel. He spent a night on the town visiting local bars and even telling someone on the dance floor that he was a serial killer, playing it off as a joke. Early morning July 15th, he headed to Gianni Versace's residence armed with the same gun he had stolen and waited for the fashion icon to emerge. He fled to hide out on a houseboat about 2 miles away from Gianni's house. When the police discovered William Reese's truck in a parking garage near Versace's, it was filled with Karnanen's clothes and newspaper articles of the murders he had committed. It was clear that he relished the notoriety. Police suspected he was in the houseboat for several days. Karnanen knew the police were closing in on him, and he was now the most wanted man in America. Over 1,000 agents were looking for him, and it was one of the biggest manhunts in history. On July 23rd, a caretaker stopped by to check up on the empty houseboat. Not knowing this was the boat concealing the fugitive. When he found him inside, he ran and phoned the police immediately. He heard a gunshot from inside and reported to police that he had found Karnanen and a shot had been fired. A SWAT team responded within minutes and waited outside watching the boat for almost 2 hours. There was no reaction from Karnanen, so the SWAT team threw tear gas onto the boat and stormed it. They found Karnanen's body on the bed upstairs in the master bedroom. He had shot himself. He left no suicide notes and no explanation for anything he had done. Andrew Karnanen's rampage was a vicious and brutal one, and the residents of Miami breathed a sigh of relief when it was all over. Karnanen left a trail of destruction behind him, and the police will never know the full extent of the events that took place over the previous months, possibly even dating back earlier. Father Modesto was eventually tracked down to his hideout in the Philippines, but had nothing to say. Around 2,000 people attended Johnny's memorial in Milan, and the amount of lives he had touched with his talents and worn personality was clear for all to see. Some of his stores dressed their mannequins in black to mourn his passing, and Versace's work was honored by a posthumous exhibit at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. From his humble beginnings, Versace created a fashion empire. It is now one of the most recognized names in the world. Capri Holdings, formerly known as Michael Kors Holdings Ltd., acquired the Versace brand in 2018 for just over $2 billion. Donatella and Santo Versace are still heavily involved in the company, with Donatella as artistic director and Santo as chairman and president. The CEO is now Jonathan Ackroyd. Gianni Versace was a gifted and creative visionary who changed the course of fashion and design. He argued against the fashion norms and carved out a new path for designers to follow for years to come. His work was undoubtedly iconic, and his place in history can never be overlooked, and he will surely never be forgotten. In Conyers, Georgia, 4:30 p.m., January 13, 2010, a police officer was doing his usual rounds in his patrol car when a 16-year-old girl, Tasmir Whitehead, came running over to the car in floods of tears. Panicked and unable to breathe, she said that she and her twin sister, Jasmir, had found their mother brutally attacked in her boyfriend's home. Items in the house were on the floor and broken, and the floor and walls were covered in blood. 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead was in the bathtub and clearly deceased. It was a harrowing sight, and her twin daughters were beside themselves. Police quickly identified a potential murder weapon. A cracked vase lay on the living room floor. Following the trail of blood, it was evident that Nikki had tried to escape from the house out the back door. But the door was locked and Nikki continued to be attacked. She had been stabbed 80 times and her spinal cord was almost severed. She eventually succumbed to her injuries and had been dragged into the bathroom and placed into the tub. It was clear whoever did this had made some attempt to clean up the evidence. But the amount of blood was overwhelming and it would have been impossible to clean the crime scene. In the linen closet next to the bathroom, a stack of towels were missing. It didn't appear as if anything had been stolen, and there were no signs of a forced entry. So whoever had committed this crime must have had a personal relationship with Nikki. Lieutenant Chris Moon said it was the bloodiest crime scene he had ever been to. The police initially wanted to talk to just one person, Robert Head, who was Nikki's long-term boyfriend. Was it a crime of passion or a violent argument that had spiraled dangerously out of control? However, Nikki's twin girls, Jasmir and Tasmir, said this wasn't possible, as Robert had left on a trucking job the day before. They did, however, point the police in another direction. Nikki had another boyfriend called Joe, and the girls said they had heard their mother arguing with him on the phone into the early hours of the morning. The investigating officers tracked Joe down and questioned him. He appeared genuinely devastated that Nikki was dead and had no idea who would want to hurt her. When asked about the argument the night before, he admitted that it happened, but said that Nikki was the aggressor. Satisfied with his version of events, the team were back at square one. Around 10 a.m., January 14th, the police needed more information about the days and weeks leading up to the murder, and the only two people who would likely know this were Jasmia and Tasmia. They took the girls to the Conyers Police Department for a victim's interview, and the girls were still visibly distressed and extremely shaken. While in the patrol car, Tasmia started biting her arm. She explained she had a nervous habit and it was something she did when she was stressed. A short while later, the interview began. The team didn't draw any attention to the scratches and bite marks on the twins, keeping their thoughts close to their chests. But it was very clear that the story the girls were telling wasn't the full version of the truth. One of the officers, Detective Swift, asked the girls if he could do anything for them, to which the twins responded, oddly asking if they could watch an episode of CSI. The officers felt at this point that they were looking at their main suspects. Although the girls admitted to having a tough relationship with their mother, this wasn't enough to establish any kind of motive. The team were also waiting on DNA evidence to come back from the house, so all they could do was let the girls go back into the custody of their great-grandmother Della. Officers began talking to Nikki's friends about Jasmir and Hasmir, and the friends painted their occasional fights in a very different light. The officers quickly realized that the twins had very much downplayed how severe and volatile these fights could be, and a dysfunctional and disturbing picture began to emerge. Tasmir and Jasmir Whitehead had both been straight-A students, high achievers, and well-behaved young girls. They were talented in many things, including dance, music, and sports, and they seemed to be on track for a great future, with dreams of going to the prestigious Harvard University. The twins' home lives, however, were a lot more difficult. Their mother, Nikki, had been born in prison while her mother was doing time for drug possession and had left home at 16 years old after years of a tumultuous relationship. She was living on the streets when she fell pregnant. The twins' father rejected Nikki and wanted nothing to do with the babies. Nikki gave birth when she was 18 and moved in with her grandmother, Della Frazier. The relationship between her and the twins was strained from the beginning, with her grandmother, Della, essentially raising them. Although Nikki was trying to better herself and be a working mother, Della said that Nikki just wasn't consistent in her children's lives and would come and go too often, partying and drinking. As Jasmer and Tasmer got older, they began to find their mother's attempts to discipline them hypocritical. However, in 2007, Nikki met 55-year-old Robert Head. They quickly hit it off and he took on the role of provider for her and the twins. He had them move in with him shortly after. He lived in Bridal Ridge Walk, a safe gated complex in a well-off area with little crime. This was a fresh start for Nikki and the girls, and it offered them a sense of stability. Robert was a long-distance truck driver and spent a lot of time away from home, leaving Nikki to look after the girls alone. This was something that friends and family said that Nikki struggled with, having never really done it alone before. The twins pushed back and fought against Nikki's discipline. One night, a 911 call was made when Nikki realized 13-year-old Jasmia had snuck out of the house to meet her boyfriend. It was clear that Nikki was losing control. "Where's your emergency? I just woke up and my daddy's gone at the house." "How old is your daughter?" "Oh no, at 13. When Nikki asked for full custody of her 13-year-old girls, it was obvious that she and her daughters had a troubled and hostile relationship, often resulting in physical fights. The trio were in and out of counseling and the girls would frequently appear in juvenile court. One fight in particular got really out of control. One evening, Nikki phoned a friend in a panic. She said that she had locked herself in the bathroom because the girls were trying to attack her. When the police arrived, Nikki showed the officers scratch marks and blood. Tasmir also had scratches on her body and claimed that her mother had started the fight. Shortly after this incident, in 2008, Della took back custody of Jasmir and Tasmir. On January 5, 2010, the now 16-year-old twins went back to live with Nikki. The girls protested, saying they didn't want to live with her, but the court ruled they needed to go, on a 2-week trial period. And tragically, just 8 days later, Nikki would be found dead. For months would pass after Nikki's murder, and with everything seemingly going quiet, the twins were back at school keeping up their grades as well as keeping a low profile. But in May of 2010, the evidence from the crime scene was finally back and analyzed, and it confirmed what the police had already suspected. The bite marks on the twins' bodies matched a plaster cast that had been made of Nikki's teeth. When Tasmia had been biting her own arm to pass it off as a stress-induced habit, it was actually her deliberately trying to leave new teeth marks over Nikki's. The vase that had been used to hit Nikki over the head was covered in the twins' blood. A pair of boots were also found covered in a mixture of blood. They had been placed neatly in a shoebox and hidden in the closet. The stack of towels missing from the linen closet were also found, and they too were covered in blood in the washing machine. These were things that a random intruder wouldn't likely do. With all this evidence finally coming together on May 21st, the last day of school, the police placed Tasmir and Jasmir under arrest for the murder of their mother. They had gone from being victims themselves to teenage killers. As soon as they were placed in the officer's car, they were heard shouting and swearing, maintaining that they had done nothing wrong. Questions from the defense team arose, arguing that the girls were identical twins, so determining whose DNA was whose was impossible. However, the prosecution argued that this was a non-issue, as it was evident that both the girls had worked together to carry out the attack. They believed that Nikki had woken the girls up for school sometime around 7 a.m., and the attack took place shortly after. They were caught walking past a gas station together, and then were picked up around 10 a.m. on the school's CCTV, arriving late to their classes. But both arrived at the same time, further cementing the prosecution's theory of them working together. This, alongside the evidence from the crime scene and the witnesses that could attest to the fighting, was enough for a grand jury to side. The prosecution, On July 12th, both girls were indicted for murder and pled not guilty. In 2012, while still awaiting trial, the attorneys for the girls put forward a request for a plea bargain. They argued that Nikki was also to blame in the situation. They said that her history of drinking and drug use played a part, coupled with her staying out late and often ignoring her children. They said that the girls simply couldn't take it anymore, and things had come to a head on January 13, 2010. It was on these grounds that they asked for the charges of murder to be dropped and voluntary manslaughter to take its place. The prosecution and the officers said they wanted to hear the confession from the girls themselves before they considered this. They met with the girls separately and they began to tell a shocking story. Jasmer and Tasmer said that Nikki had come home drunk the night before the incident took place. She began hurling abuse at them, which carried on into the morning. When the girls came down for breakfast, things started to unravel. On January 9, 2014, almost exactly 4 years since Nikki had been killed, Tasmia appeared in Rockdale County Court to enter a plea of guilty to voluntary manslaughter. 1 month later, Jasmia followed suit. They were both sentenced to 30 years for the crime, and their attorney said that this sentence allowed the girl some sort of future. Jasmia graduated high school in prison and served as class valedictorian. Her great-grandmother, Della Frazier, was there to watch her graduate. Nikki Whitehead was met with a terrible end at the hands of her daughters, and no one will ever truly know what happened inside that house on January 13, 2010. But the events that took place were undoubtedly avoidable and horrifying. They shocked even the most tenured of officers. The girls were incarcerated at separate prisons within the Georgia Department of Corrections. Tasmir is serving her sentence in Pulaski State Prison, and Jasmir at Arundel State Prison. They were eligible for parole in 2017, which they did not receive. If they do not receive parole at any point, they will be scheduled for release in 2040. They will be 47 years old. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On the 27th of February 1974, Peter and Joan Lawrence welcomed their second child into the world, a little girl named Claudia. Peter Lawrence was a highly respected and successful solicitor, and the family lived comfortably in Yorkshire. Claudia was educated at the prestigious York College for Girls, and by all accounts had a very happy childhood. Although her parents would later divorce, Claudia remained close to both of them. She was sociable and friendly and had a great group of friends. As she got older, she discovered her passion for cooking, and after attending a local catering college, she quickly became a qualified chef. She worked in various restaurants and hotels in York, but soon grew tired of the unsociable hours and wanted a change. Claudia was a bubbly young woman who loved nothing more than being with family and friends. So she changed employment and began working at Goodricke College at the University of York. She was well-liked, and her employer described her as a reliable woman who was always on time. A year later, in 2007, she settled into the area and bought a cottage about 3 miles away from Goodricke College. Life for Claudia was seemingly going well. Close to her house was the Nag's Head pub, and she was a regular there, becoming a well-liked patron of the business. Although she was close with her parents and older sister Ollie, she kept some aspects of her life hidden. She allegedly had a series of short-term relationships but did not share this with people. Wednesday, March 18, 2009, Claudia clocked in at 6 a.m. to start her shift at work. At around 2 p.m., it was time for her to finish, and she was seen on CCTV leaving work on foot. Around an hour later, she was picked up again on CCTV, passing a shop close to where she'd lived, and she was also spotted by one of her neighbors. Shortly after this sighting, a colleague drove past her and offered her a lift home. The colleague dropped her off outside her door at 2:50 p.m. Throughout the evening, she caught up with her friends and parents over the phone. Her mother said that during their conversation, Claudia seemed like her usual self. She was chatty and relaxed. Mother's Day was coming up, and they discussed what they wanted to do to celebrate. Claudia told her mom that as her car was out of action and being repaired, She would need to be in bed early as she had to walk to work the next day. The following morning rolled round, and as it approached 6 a.m., the always punctual Claudia failed to turn up. Her manager knew this was out of character and called her mobile to check on her. Although her phone rang, it redirected to her voicemail. Her manager took no further action. Claudia also arranged to meet her friend Susie Cooper at the Nag's Head pub near her house that evening. Susie turned up, but Claudia did not. This was not like Claudia, and Susie tried to contact her. Claudia was often on her phone, a Samsung D900, and Susie became concerned when she heard nothing back from her. The following morning, Friday the 20th of March, Susie tried again, but she was met with no response. She decided to get in touch with Goodrich College to see if anyone had seen or heard from her. She was deeply worried when they discovered that Claudia had not been to work for the last 2 days. Susie contacted Claudia's father Peter that day to let him know that she hadn't been to work, and people couldn't get hold of her. Peter traveled to Claudia's home, where he and Susie did a search of the house. Nothing was out of place, and nothing was disturbed. It looked like she had eaten breakfast, as there were dishes in the sink and her bed had been neatly made. Some recently used hair dye bottles and gloves were also found, but nothing of any real significance was there, and everything was where it should be. The only thing missing from the house was her mobile phone, a blue rucksack which she would usually take to work. Haha, straighten us. When considering everything, it appeared that Claudia had left to go to work as normal that Thursday morning, and something had happened on the way which meant she never made it there. At around 2 p.m. on Friday, the 20th of March, the call was made to North Yorkshire Police to report Claudia as a missing person. Later that day, officers came to Claudia's house and met with her father, but as there were no signs of violence and she wasn't considered vulnerable, the police initially were not quick to act. The police believed that Claudia had probably chosen to go away for a few days and that she would come home soon. But just to be sure, they put out a request for the public's help and checked her usual route to work for any signs of her. But Claudia's family were adamant that she wouldn't leave without telling people. They argued it was more likely that she had been abducted. In the North Yorkshire area, around 3,500 people go missing each year. The vast majority eventually turn up after taking a few days or weeks away. And the police thought that this could have been what Claudia had done. But as time went on and no sign of her was found and she hadn't contacted anyone, this was soon dismissed. The police had several theories about what could have potentially happened to Claudia. One theory was that she hadn't been met with foul play, but had an accident or other medical incident on her way to work. This was soon ruled out by the police, however, as they thoroughly checked her route and found no sign of her. Weeks were passed, and with no sign of Claudia, 5 weeks after she vanished, the police changed their inquiry. They said it had escalated from a missing persons case to a murder inquiry. Another theory was that Claudia had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time and fallen victim to a violent criminal or serial killer. But a conclusive result couldn't be drawn from investigating these claims, and cases of known serial killers who could have been in the area at the time were also looked into, but ultimately ruled out. Statistically, most murder victims are known to their killers. The theory that police soon made the top of their priority to investigate was that she had fallen victim to somebody she knew, with her different relationships making her potentially more vulnerable to an angry, jilted partner or something similar. The police checked the CCTV cameras following her route to work, but she wasn't found anywhere on the footage. As the case began to escalate, Crime Stoppers offered a reward of £10,000 for anyone with information that would lead to an arrest and conviction relating to Claudia Lawrence. The police received over 1,000 calls, offering a plethora of information. A witness came forward to say they had seen whom they believed to be Claudia talking to a man on Melrose Gate Bridge at around 5:35 a.m. on the 19th of March. The bridge was near to Claudia's home. He claimed that the man was smoking a cigarette in his left hand and had what they said was a skinny build. He was wearing a dark-colored hoodie with the hood up and dark-colored combat trousers. The woman with him was described as smaller than the man with mousy brown hair. She was wearing a blue waist-length jacket with buttons and pockets. But nothing really came of this, and to this day the police are still following up leads for who they dubbed the left-handed smoker. The case brought the local community to a standstill, and people from all over the country were desperate for any news on the missing Claudia. One of the leading figures in the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, made an appeal for anyone with information to come forward to the police. In June 2009, Crime Watch featured a reconstruction of Claudia's last known movements in a bid to generate more information. It's now 11 weeks since Claudia disappeared. There's been no proof of life. I'm treating this investigation as one of suspected murder. You see, some people might think they're protecting Claudia and they're protecting Claudia's reputation, but it's far, far more important than that if indeed we are talking here about murder. I mean, you do want to hear from people who even have suspicions about other people. That would be useful to you at this stage. Absolutely. I'm not here to judge Claudia's relationships. I'm here to investigate them. I need people to share that information with me. Later that month, her father Peter launched a YouTube appeal to try and help find his missing daughter. The annual Whitby Regatta was also used to drum up publicity in the search for Claudia Lawrence. Claudia was an avid user of her mobile phone, so this became a key piece of evidence for the police to investigate. Her phone records showed that in the weeks leading up to her going missing, she had spent a lot of time in the Acomb area of Yorkshire. Claudia's phone was still on until just after midday on Thursday the 19th. It was then deliberately switched off. Cell phone tower data indicated that her phone had not left the local area during the time it was on. After examining the records further, they found that on the 18th of March, the day before she went missing, she received a text message at 8:30 which she replied to. But just 45 minutes later at 9:15, she got another text which she did not respond to. It was reported that the last text Claudia received was from a man who lived in Cyprus. Following on from the text message she received, in September of 2009, the police revealed that they had extended their search to Cyprus. She had holidayed there several times, and it was also believed that she had looked for job opportunities there too. The man in charge of the investigation, Detective Superintendent Ray Galloway, said she knew several people who lived there and had received different job offers while visiting. He said that some of the people who had been spoken to were reluctant to offer information. Several months would pass with still no sign of Claudia Lawrence. Christmas and New Year's came and went, and her family faced their first painful holiday without their beloved daughter and sister. In March the following year, the police began searching Heslington and York based on information they'd received in the previous few days. On the 24th of that month, a muddy track near a play park was searched, and the next day the search was moved to a field near the University of York. These searches, however, would turn up nothing. It was later considered that the search had been prompted by somebody providing false information. Detective Superintendent Galloway said that Claudia's relationships and love life could provide an explanation into her going missing. A journalist for Sky TV stated this was the only missing persons case they had covered where they had been threatened and warned to stay away, not once but twice. After an extensive initial investigation, the most likely theory police believe probable was that Claudia had left for work that morning and that she had been abducted and murdered by a local man she knew. For years would pass and Claudia's family was still no closer to finding out what had happened to her. In June 2013, the North Yorkshire Police announced that they had formed a new major crime unit, costing £300,000. In October of that year, they revealed they were opening several cold cases, one of which was Claudia Lawrence. The squad at the Major Crimes Unit re-examined the case and also conducted new forensic searches of her house. Science had moved on since the initial investigation, which allowed for more advanced techniques to be used. During these further tests, they found male DNA on a cigarette butt in her car. 5 years to the day after her disappearance, Crime Watch aired CCTV that had been discovered back in 2009. It showed a silver Ford Focus hatchback driving along the road she'd lived on. The CCTV showed that as the car approached Claudia's house, the brake lights came on. Another vehicle that the police wanted to track down was a white Vauxhall Astra van that had been picked up on a bus's camera. It was parked on the opposite side of the road across from Claudia's house, and was there for at least 30 minutes around 9 p.m. on Wednesday, March 18th. Before long, the case would take a surprising turn. D. Mallon was now heading the investigation and several arrests were promptly made. All the men arrested were believed to have either had relationships with Claudia or had insight into said relationships. In May 2014, the police arrested a 59-year-old man on suspicion of murdering Claudia Lawrence. but in November he was released from bail without charge. In July 2014, another arrest was made. Paul Harris was the landlord of the Cone Pub and was arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice, but he too was released without charge. He explained that his only connection to Claudia had been that she had a drink in his pub in the weeks leading up to her going missing, and apart from that, he had no relationship with her. On the 6th anniversary of her disappearance, police released CCTV that was spread through the media like wildfire. At 7:15 p.m. on the 18th of March, just a day before she was considered missing, cameras near her home picked up some interesting footage. The footage shows an area near an alleyway at the back of Claudia's house. A person is seen walking towards the alley. Just over a minute later, they walk back out. Someone else is crossing the road ahead and the person walking pauses to let them pass. The footage unsettled many, and the police urged the public to help find who these two people were. On the same CCTV camera around 10 hours later at 5:07 a.m., someone is spotted again walking backwards and forwards from the same alley behind Claudia's house. The police wondered if this was the same person, and what, if any relevance, this bore to the disappearance of Claudia. If it was of any relevance, this could have been linked to the witness that claimed to see someone they thought may have been Claudia talking to a male that was smoking on Melrose Gate Bridge. The timing was just 20 minutes apart, and in the same location by her house. In 2016, the North Yorkshire Police took the case to the Crown Prosecution Service, asking that 4 men be charged and put on trial for the murder of Claudia Lawrence. The Crown Prosecution Service refused, saying there was a lack of sufficient evidence. The 4 men had drank at the Nag's Head pub but denied being involved in Claudia going missing. The police said that witnesses had refused to cooperate and the second investigation was ended soon after. Stephen Fulcher was the senior investigating officer into the crimes committed by notorious murderer Christopher Hallowell. In his book detailing his work on that case, he noted the similarities between Claudia's case and that of Sian O'Callaghan, who was murdered by Hallowell in 2011. He was also convicted of the murder of Becky Gooden in 2016. Christopher Hallowell was interviewed about Claudia in prison and flatly denied he had played any part in her disappearance and possible murder. The witness account of seeing a skinny male smoking a cigarette with his left hand on Melrose Gate Bridge fit the physical description of Hallowell. Despite many people's theories surrounding Hallowell's possible involvement in the case, both North Yorkshire Police and Wiltshire Police have said there is no evidence to link Hallowell to the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence. Questions surrounding how the initial investigation was handled were asked, and people wanted to know why things hadn't moved quickly enough. After Claudia's disappearance, her father began a tireless campaign for a change in the law. In July of 2019, Claudia's law was passed which allowed for a guardian to be appointed if a person had been missing for more than 90 days. It meant direct debits could be stopped and financial affairs managed in their absence. Tragically, less than 2 years later, her father Peter died in February 2021, without ever finding out what had happened to his missing daughter. Friends and family remain hopeful that they will one day be able to answer the question, what happened to Claudia Lawrence? Peter Lawrence, Claudia's father, set up a website with all the relevant links and contact information. Should you wish to leave a tip of any kind about Claudia's case, I've left a link to that in the description, along with some other sites you can visit to help keep Claudia's case as active as possible. Phoenix Lucille Colden was born Phoenix Reeves on May 23, 1988, to parents Goldier and Lawrence. Her father Lawrence adopted her soon after she was born, and her name was changed to Colden. She was born in California, but the family moved to an area of Spanish for Lawrence's job. She was an only child. Inquisitive, bright, and creative, Phoenix showed incredible talent and promise from a young age. The Coldens were a deeply spiritual and religious family, and Phoenix would attend church regularly, and she was also in the choir. Friends of Phoenix said she lived a very disciplined life and that her parents, although were loving and supportive, were also very strict with high expectations. Friends claimed that Phoenix had expressed a desire to break away from her sheltered life and experience everything that came with school and college. She had been mostly homeschooled from the 6th grade. She worked hard at all her studies and was a very high achiever. Her main passion, however, appeared to be music, where she excelled, playing violin and piano. She was also a regional junior fencing champion. In 2007, she enrolled at the University of Missouri and by this point had already moved out of the family home and into an apartment. Her parents signed the lease believing she was moving in with a friend. Her parents also said that it was around this time that Phoenix started acting differently and began arguing with them frequently. However, this was a big change for Phoenix. She had gone from a relatively sheltered upbringing to a completely new and open world at university, which may have caused some tensions between her and her parents. What her parents didn't realize, however, was that Phoenix was in a relationship with someone named Michael B., and she was actually living in the apartment with him. Her mother said that although she visited the apartment regularly, there was nothing to indicate she had a secret live-in boyfriend. Her friend speculated she may have felt this was the only way she could see Michael B., and she had to keep it a total secret. When Goldie had found out about the relationship, she said that Michael B. was not someone she would have approved of her daughter dating. Phoenix began to miss her college classes, which culminated in her failing to register for her 4th semester, another fact her parents and friends would not find out about for a long time. During the early months of 2011, it is said that Phoenix began taking money from the family. The money was in saving bonds, and although it was Phoenix's money, it was in her mother's name. A total of around $2,500 was taken, and where the money ended up remains a mystery. In May of 2011, she moved back into the family home. Her mother said this was purely down to finances. Phoenix was able to study at university and stay at home, and this was far more cost-effective than her parents paying out for an apartment. Little did Goldie know, but Phoenix was not attending university at this time. When she returned from college, everyone who knew Phoenix described her as a totally different person. Her friends said that she had started experimenting with drugs, arguing with her parents more and pushing people away. Her best friend and neighbor Akira commented that she wasn't the friend she once knew. She said she seemed paranoid, irritable, and erratic, and she was convinced that she was being followed. During a brief and trivial argument with Akira, Phoenix pulled a knife and brandished it at her. She kept this 10-inch blade down the side of her car door, with no explanation as to why. Although the pair would move past the fight, Akira could tell that something was very wrong, and no one could seemingly get to the bottom of it. Phoenix would often sit in her car for long periods of time, spending hours on her phone, and her mother began to wonder why she needed even more privacy than that of her own room in her own house. It was later discovered that Phoenix had 2 phones. One was on a family plan and one she was seemingly paying for herself. It seemed that Phoenix's life was far more complex and complicated than anyone had realized. December 18, 2011 would start as any other day in the Colden household. Phoenix and her mom attended the Sunday church service at 11 a.m., where Phoenix played in the bell choir. Fellow churchgoers and her pastor said nothing seemed off or amiss with Phoenix that day. Phoenix and her mom traveled back in Phoenix's car, briefly stopping at a convenience store on the way. During the car journey, Phoenix said to her mother that she wanted things to get back to how they had used to be. Goldie seemed hopeful that this would be a step forward in their relationship. They returned to the house at around 2 p.m. Phoenix changed into some sweatpants and a hoodie and went outside to play basketball. Just after 3 p.m., Phoenix grabbed her phone, passed her father who had just returned from work without engaging in conversation, and got into her 1998 Chevy Blazer and pulled away from the house. Assuming she was going shopping or visiting friends, Lawrence didn't think anything of this. But sadly, this would be the last time he would ever see his daughter. And that is where the 18th of December takes a sinister turn. Phoenix always stuck to her parents' curfew of 1 a.m. and had never stayed away from the house all night. And when she still wasn't home the following morning, Goldie knew in her gut that something serious had happened to her child. When she phoned the St. Louis County Police Department to report her daughter as missing, she was met with a lot of pushback. The officer who took the call told Goldie that Phoenix was a 23-year-old woman and was old enough to make her own decisions about where she went. But Goldie knew despite this was simply not in her daughter's nature, and her age was irrelevant. The officer ran Phoenix's car number plate through the system and said it hadn't turned up anything. Goldie and Lawrence were now frantic with worry, so decided to take matters into their own hands. They phoned around the hospitals to see if anyone fitting her description had been omitted and began circulating flyers. They contacted various television networks begging for her case to be circulated, but the networks failed to pick up the case. No one was following up on the case or reporting on it, and the Colden family felt ignored and let down. Valuable time was being lost, and Phoenix's family were working incredibly hard to keep the case in people's minds, trying to make up for the lack of coverage and interest in it. About 2 weeks later, her parents finally located her car. It was sitting impounded in a tow yard, having been there since the day she disappeared. The car was discovered just a 25-minute drive away from her home. At 5:30 p.m., this was around 3 hours after Phoenix had left her house. The car had been impounded less than an hour after it was found. In 2018, the network Oxygen looked into Phoenix Colden's case. Investigative reporter Chandria Thomas and retired police chief Joseph Delia headed the investigation and began uncovering more information. Chandria Thomas was actually a huge reason that Phoenix's case was brought to the media's attention, and she fought hard to keep it there too. Joe and Chandria looked into the state of Phoenix's car was found in. There have been many conflicting stories surrounding the car since the start of the search for Phoenix. It was originally reported to have been found on the side of the road. The engine was still running, the keys were in the ignition, and the driver's side door was open. Phoenix's shoes and purse were also in the car. Chandria and Joe met with Officer Perry, who initially found the car and told them that the doors were closed. No key was in the ignition, and apart from a few random miscellaneous items, there had been nothing of interest inside the vehicle. He said it looked like the car had simply been pulled over and parked, almost as if someone had run out of fuel. When Officer Perry ran the license plate through the system, it did not flag up as stolen or suspicious, and thus it was towed off. The reason this may not have flagged up was that the car was now in a different area that had a separate police department, meaning any connections to the missing Phoenix in Spanish Lake would likely not have been made. At the time the car was found, Phoenix was not yet listed as a missing person either. One thing that was determined about the car was that the only DNA found inside belonged to Phoenix and her parents. The location of her car rang alarm bells with Goldier. It was in a derelict, run-down and dangerous area of East St. Louis, known for crime and drugs, and her mother said she would have had no business being in that part of town. Had the car been stolen, driven there and dumped? Had she driven it there herself and left it? Or had she been snatched from inside the car? More evidence was garnered from the 2018 review of the case regarding her phone records. On the 17th of December, just a day before she was last seen, she made a total of 10 phone calls to her secret boyfriend Michael B., using the phone on her family plan. That final call was 116 minutes long. On the 18th of December 2011, phone records again showed that the last person she spoke to using the phone on her family plan was again Michael B. This call was made at 1:46 p.m. and lasted just 1 minute. It appeared from looking at the phone records that this was the last call Phoenix ever made from that phone. Although officers said they were keeping any further information about the phone records and coordinates of the phone close to their chest, while the case is still being investigated. Although people initially reported that Phoenix's boyfriend Michael B. had been evasive, the investigating officers reported he was actually very cooperative, and they were confident that he was in no way involved in Phoenix's disappearance. A theory that was presented early on, one that remains a theory to this day, was that she had potentially been taken by a human trafficking gang. The St. Louis area remains one of the top areas in the country for human trafficking, and this fact couldn't be overlooked. The highway close to where her car had been found, Interstate 70, is referred to as the trafficking highway. This theory was further fueled when a picture of her allegedly began circulating on a sex website, but it is believed that this was most likely nothing more than a nasty hoax. Another common thought was that the pressure in Phoenix's life had resulted in her wanting to start afresh and leave everything behind. Her best friend Akira said that Phoenix had told her she had wanted to pack her things and leave, but to where? Phoenix never said. The theory that she may have ran away has always been disputed by her family. Akira would also claim that Phoenix was secretly seeing another man alongside Michael B. His name was also Mike, and he was referred to as Cell Phone Mike. Akira believed this new relationship was most likely the reason for the second phone. One of Cell Phone Mike's ex-girlfriends was interviewed, and she said that Mike had been violent with her during their relationship, resulting in her filing a restraining order against him. She alleged that Mike had taken an interest in Phoenix's case and would often look it up online. When she asked him about Phoenix, he replied, "Why are you worrying about someone who's dead?" It remains unknown if he had any involvement in Phoenix Colden's disappearance, or if he was just making a speculative, albeit crass, comment. In a now infamous and haunting video, Phoenix films herself as she sits in the car. The full video has never been released, but Chandria Thomas and Joe Delia looked into it closely during their investigation. They took the video to an audio engineer to get a full and clear understanding of what it was Phoenix had said. She asks God to help her accept the things she cannot change and says, "I probably would have been in a better situation if I would have just stuck with how I used to be." She goes on to say, "The only person that won't let me down is me." She is clearly very emotional and distressed, and it was evident that Phoenix was struggling deeply with something. The video was recorded just 1 month before she disappeared. In March 2014, a reported sighting of Phoenix came in. One of Phoenix's friends from church was getting ready to fly back from Vegas, and all the passengers were boarding the plane. As she sat down, she says Phoenix walked past her in the aisle with a group of women and 2 older men. Her friend said she called out her name when the lady turned round and looked at her. She said, "Sorry, do I look like someone?" and carried on walking. Her friend noted that the women all looked similar to Phoenix, and the men appeared to be around 10 years older than the women. When she got off the plane, she ran straight to the service desk and reported that she had seen the missing person. Although the police quickly began searching the area, no trace of the woman in question was ever found. Her friend said on a scale of 1 to 10 of how confident she was that it was Phoenix Colden, she was a definite 9. Many tips came in that would lead the family and police nowhere. Everything from fake phone calls with people pretending to be the missing Phoenix, to tip-offs claiming that Phoenix was involved in a cult and couldn't escape. But one tip in particular would cost the Coldens dearly. A man provided seemingly credible information about Phoenix's whereabouts, and Goldier and Lawrence spent their remaining savings on a private investigator to follow up on this lead. The lead turned out to be nothing more than a cruel hoax. Goldier and Lawrence had reached their financial limits and were forced to make a quick sale on their home. They had to move out of the area and the family home that they had loved so much. During the 2018 look into Phoenix's case, Chandria Thomas and Joe Delia found that Phoenix had 2 birth certificates, one under Phoenix Colden and one under Phoenix Reeves. A private investigator looked into the certificate under the name of Reeves and found that there was actually a Phoenix Reeves. This Phoenix Reeves had no social security number and no associated birth date. The only thing that linked with that name was an address that was listed as being occupied between the dates of January 2012, June 2012. Before January 2012, this Phoenix Reeves did not exist, and this person would cease to exist after June of that year. The person living in the house at the time of the 2018 investigation said she had been the sole occupier of that house since 2002, and no one by the name of Phoenix had ever lived there. Although eerie and a most definitely interesting lead, it appeared that this was nothing more than a strange coincidence. One thing that is for certain is that since Phoenix disappeared, no money has been taken from her bank accounts, no forms of identification have been renewed, and her digital footprint is non-existent. Everything seemed to stop on December 18, 2011. Therefore, the possibility of this case ultimately being a homicide has never been ruled out. What happened to 23-year-old Phoenix Colden on December 18, 2011 remains a total mystery, and no trace of her has ever been found. Was she abducted on December 18th? Did she leave of her own accord to start a new life? It is still an ongoing case, and her family and friends continuously pray and hope for answers. Her parents believe that she is still alive and being held somewhere against her will. They have never given up hope that she will one day come home. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Phoenix Colden, please contact the Spanish Lake Police Department